Good afternoon and welcome to this Great Soils webinar on short-term green manure strategies for intensive growers, which will be presented by Ian Wilkinson, Managing Director of Cotswold Seeds. Great Soils is a programme of work funded by AHDB Horticulture, including projects CP 107, 107B, 107C and 107D. Project 107B, Growing Resilient, Efficient and Thriving Great Soils, is delivered in partnership by Earthcare Technical Limited, the Organic Research Centre and the Soil Association.
Hello, Kat. Thank you very much and good afternoon to you. Good warm welcome to everybody. Greetings from the Cotswolds. I'm based currently, as we speak, in Moreton in Marsh. I know we've got people from all over the country and one or two also possibly from outside of the UK, so I'll make this as broad as I can, but still keeping on topic. It's a beautiful day here in the Cotswolds. I've actually just walked the dog around the fields in pretty much in short-sleeved shirt, and it's chilly, but it's not what it was 2 days ago when it was pouring with rain here. We quite literally had an inch of rain, and it reminded me, having had a dry summer, relatively dry summer where we are, how the season varies and how important it is to keep a cover on the surface of the soil. And I suppose fundamentally that's what we're talking about with green manures today. The heading, or the subject is short-term green manures and the strategies that growers might use. But it's really important that we get a good understanding of the fundamental principles of what we're doing so that we can do just that and create strategies around cropping. I'm going to talk about a lot of different things. Please feel free to ask questions as we go. As Kat said, there will be an opportunity at the end. I really don't mind being interrupted. Kat will draw my attention to any issues as we go. We've got a few questions for you as well to bring it to life, to see what growers are currently practicing in some areas, and that will enable me to sort of hone in on the details that hopefully you'll want to see. I've been doing my job as a seed expert, if you like, for 30 years. I'm also a farmer. We have a mixed farm, which I'll tell you a little bit about later on. And needless to say that my experience has been drawn from across a great many ranges of farms and growers' experiences. And I'm fortunate to have the job that I have because I can pull that knowledge together and hopefully give back some of that in the next 35, 45 minutes. So moving on, let's just see, which button do I press?
Before we move on, Ian, did you want to see how many people are already using green manures?
That would be a great place to start, wouldn't it? Let's do that, please. Kat, can you explain how we do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So throughout the webinar, we're going to have a few different polls. So we're going to ask you to participate. So I'm about to launch the first one. So you should now see something pop up on your screen which says, do you currently use green manures in your rotation? So if you could select either yes or no.
It's a really interesting question. I'm assuming that we'll get quite a few people that are using them. Bear in mind, everybody's use of green manures is always really different, but we just want to establish really, what proportion of the people that are with us for the next little while are actually using green manures, because it does, it will tell a story, and let's just see what the result is. We should get some feedback in a few seconds. It always amazes me, in any group of people, the diversity of views that you have, and some people can be quite well experienced and others without any experience at all, but it's really important that we all get a good understanding of this subject matter.
Was there anyone else who wanted to vote? It looks like most people have voted now, and yeah, it looks like 75% of people are using green manures and 25% not yet.
That's great, thanks, Kat. So that doesn't surprise me, and it's really important because if you go back to when I started, there was virtually no green manure used, and it's interesting how as the years have gone on, a lot of people are now beginning to incorporate them into their crop rotations for so many good reasons. I mean, we're not going to get too much into the nitty-gritty of soil science today, but the fact of the matter is, we do have to add organic matters back in one form or another, and when it comes to doing that, there aren't that many options. There are green manures, or cover crops as they're sometimes referred to these days, as one option. There's compost, of course, and there's some form of animal manure. But green manures for most growers will represent the most obvious source and most obvious solution, often combined with the other two methods of compost or animal waste. But it's the green manure fundamentally that is going to make such a big difference, and it's the thing that a lot of systems, farming systems, have lost over the years. And so really what we're talking about, I suppose if you had to summarize now and say, well, what exactly is a green manure going to do? It's going to add organic matter. It's going to increase the amount of organic matter in the soil, and that's the most important thing. And by doing that, we get all the other bits. The soil will hold more water. It will be more resilient. The structure will be much easier to work with, and so on. So it's the adding the organic matter bit that's very, very important, and that can really only be done by putting in decaying life. So that's the decaying remnants of plants and animals or animal waste, and that's the only source of it. No matter how much fertilizer we add, we will never add a single drop of organic matter. Fertilizer does not contain any, and that's the problem with a lot of systems at the moment, whereby they're unsustainable, frankly, and that's why the soils are being depleted of organic matter. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but I think it's really important to stress that in some parts of the country, here in the UK certainly, we have quite good soils, but there is a real risk that unless we put the organic matter back in somehow or other, we will lose the quality of that soil, and once it's gone, it's really difficult to get it back. It's a very slow process to lose it, but it's also very difficult indeed to bring it back in. So I believe organic matter addition is the real one of the biggest challenges that food production in this country faces. I want to talk about how green manures will affect that. I want to talk also a little bit about livestock as a management tool for growers. Livestock aren't always included into crop rotations, of course, and there has been over the last few decades a real polarization of the livestock in the western district, which fundamentally goes on grass, and a sort of crop growing areas in the east and the Midlands where there are very few livestock left. But they are an interesting tool, and I'll give you some reasons in a minute as we go through this as to why you might consider them in some cases. And then finally, I'm going to give you some information, it'll be brief, but on case studies of some systems that do build soil health, and just see how one or two growers go about doing just that. And bear in mind that whatever we discuss in the next while, everybody's farm is different, everybody's soil is different, everybody has different requirements. So it's the principles that are important, not specifically the detail. I'm going to avoid things like so many kilos per acre of seed. It's not relevant for this discussion. There's a lot more important things to talk about. We can cover those details separately. So these are the sort of scenarios that we come across, all of us come across, and they can be all sorts of different combinations, but these are just three sort of fairly typical scenarios. And feel free, perhaps later on in the conversation to sort of say, well, I have a specific scenario in my case, how might I go about adding organic matter into the system? But there are some basic ones. So for example, and especially now, I've just mentioned about the rainfall we had here, and a lot of the countries have this recently, high levels of rainfall, and without a green cover on the soil, we lose a lot of the key nutrients that we would have effectively wash down the drain. But with winter green covers, we can hold a lot of that. Bare ground, of course, in the summer is a wasted opportunity. If we can have green crops that are fixing nitrogen and adding organic matter while there's that fantastically long growing period with long daylight hours, we can add in huge amounts of organic matter. Remember, the organic matter is this decaying remnant of plant and animal life, and if we think about it, we need as much as possible. So it's the total quantity that counts, and that should be the driving force behind all our decisions with green manures. And then there's the longer term fertility building situations, which we're not going to talk about so much today because this is about short term fertility building, but they are the real solution to long term fertility building. And so I'll give you a couple of examples as we go through about how long term fertility building lays would be quite important for a lot of future a lot of farm systems. So I'm going to start by just explaining why I don't believe one single plant species can do everything that we need to improve the soil. In my job, I'm asked to provide a lot of different solutions with a seed mix, and this is a short list, really a short list of the sort of things that different growers have on their priority list. And you can see there's quite a lot of different, very diverse things that people wish to achieve. And so for that reason, if you think, well, is it possible that one single green manure plant species can provide everything for the soil? It's obvious that They can't, and there are so many things. I'm not going to go through each of these in detail, but you can see the sort of, the variance in the requirements for green manures. And thinking of a simple green manure like mustard, for example, this is what everybody thinks about when you think green manuring. It's a fast-growing annual plant. And yes, it does add biomass, and it does do it very quickly, and it's relatively cheap seed, and it has some things going for it, but it's only when you look to see what else you might achieve by growing a second plant species, a different plant species, with something like mustard, that you begin to realize that something like mustard that breaks down really quickly, that doesn't fix any nitrogen, that isn't persistent, has a limitation. But by putting another species, in this case a grass, which is higher in carbon, takes longer to break down, lasts for longer, suddenly you're getting a more diverse mix. And when you add more species in, you see more and more benefits coming. In this case, obviously, the clover plant is one that can fix nitrogen, and it can fix huge amounts of nitrogen, and it will grow with these other species. It's also, as you can see from the bee there, brilliant for pollinators, and different plants for different pollinators are really important. So again, if you only have one flowering species for your pollinators, then you may be only feeding half of the population. And then finally, you can add in the diverse, very much more diverse plants. So, for example, depicted here by chicory, which is a deeper rooting plant, which has massive impacts on soil structure. Roots of chicory, for example, will break up soil pans. They'll break up through plough pans. There's nothing it won't go through. You can see the difference in the length of the roots and why you're growing in a different space, in a different time, above ground and also below the surface. And as time goes on, these roots become more complex, and the longer the plants are in the ground, the more effect you'll have with mycorrhizal fungi, the more earthworm population will increase, the more protozoa, nematodes and so on will expand. So it's a sort of a process of building. And the yields of roots below the surface of the soil can be as substantial as the biomass on the top. And never forget that. And I'll show you some illustrations in a minute which will really show you just that result. So you need to really, as we all know, get the spade out, dig down and have a look. In fact, you need probably more than a spade on most soils. You just won't get far enough down to see what you've really got below the surface. Charles Darwin I refer to quite a lot. I mean, some of his work was really fantastically far-sighted and of great interest to us these days. When he walked from his garden to a local landscape, which was a grass landscape, he noticed that the diverse mixtures that he could see, and he was looking specifically at different grasses growing together, was over-yielding where he might grow only one species in their own right. So he found back 200 years ago that by growing two very different plant species together, there was an over-yielding effect. And that's really important. The same four species that we looked at just now, the mustard, the grass, the clover and the chicory, I've depicted here on a bar chart. And you can see very clearly the differences in the yield. So naturally, as a farmer, you think, well, we'll go for the highest yielding one. And sort of logically, that makes sense. But when you look at the potential for the average, you think, well, if we put all those together, what are we likely to achieve in the field as an average biomass yield? And there's what I would suggest most people would logically think to. But what Darwin found, and what all our modern science has found, is that there's an over-yielding effect. And it's not just a little bit. It's not 2 or 3% more than the average. It's 50% more. This 47% figure actually comes from some research that was done in 2013 on an extremely large, wide-scale project right across Europe, looking at the over-yielding effect of combining 4 different plant species together. They have to be very different plant species. It's no good just having 2 or 3 varieties of a ryegrass or 2 or 3 types of red clover. They have to be really different, so they're filling in the different spaces in time. But that yield effect, that over-yielding effect, is for nothing. It's free of charge, and it's the thing that gives us the extra biomass yield that is, a nature. It's just a freebie, and we should all be, in my opinion, using it. These green manure crops are not harvestable crops in the same way that we think of normal crops, and we can combine different species together to great effect. You can see here that this illustration depicts just the way the photosynthesis is working with different plants at different levels in the in the physical space. And obviously, with it sort of doesn't need a description. The picture says it all. The sunlight is captured at many different levels, and there's a lot of agroforestry schemes being developed which are doing exactly the same thing. And I believe that for green manuring and for soil improvement, it's such an obvious thing to harness, and we shouldn't miss the opportunity. There's a local farmer just down the road from me here. He came to the Cotswolds many years ago, back in the 1940s, and he had this lovely rule of good husbandry, and that was to leave the soil in better heart than he found it. And a lot of people have said this over the years. This is just one man that happens to be local to me. And I think it's a real truism. I don't think we can afford to ignore this, particularly at the moment with all the pressures on land use and all the environmental changes that we are experiencing. So this is a way in which we all think and have increasingly are being taught to think. But it's a long-term problem, and it's a long-term investment, if you like. This is one of my daughters. I'm fortunate to have 4 children, and this is my youngest. My children are all sort of in their late teens, 20s now, and early 20s, and they're all sort of university stage. And she tells me that it's an investment, Daddy. It's fine to to invest in my future. And they're all having a great time. But I do genuinely think that actually this investment will be paid back. But I know, like all of us, and this applies so much not just to children but to the soil, it is a generational investment. It's a lifetime investment. But we can't afford not to make it. We've seen other parts of the world where, through development of civilization, we have lost soil quality, and when it's gone, it's gone. We have an increasing world population, and the soil, to me, seems like the the thing that we cannot overlook. If we do, we do it at our peril. So that's the way I think, and I work on that premise. And when it comes to you or me deciding on the policy for our soil fertility, we have to sort of think, well, where are we now? How do we reconcile our long-term thinking into our immediate plans? And so for a large part of our agriculture and horticulture, we have monoculture. So this is where we're at, and not unsurprisingly, the low organic matter levels that we are experiencing in our first-class arable soils is at a low level, largely because of monoculture, in my opinion. So the question is, what can we do to change that? And if you think of this chart as a theoretical example, this is not a precise one, every farm is going to be different, but think about what we might do to improve our organic matter. And in this case, I'm suggesting that by crop diversity, and with the 3-crop rule, for example, this is helpful, and it might increase our soil organic matter and our soil fertility by a little. When you start to add green manures into that crop diversity, you would expect, and I'm sure you would get, additional organic matter going into the system. So that's 2 things: more types of crops and green manures. And obviously, with what I've said about Darwin and his observations with the over-yielding effect, you would, of course, wouldn't you, grow multiple species of green manures in the same field, and not just necessarily the green manures as monoculture. So crop diversity plus multi-species green manures will increase your organic matter, and so far so good. For me, the icing on the cake, or perhaps a destination that some people might go, would be then to introduce livestock into that soil fertility plan, because by putting those in, you then increase the soil's biology, and it seems to me that when you go to farms and growers that have introduced livestock back into their systems, you can see the farm soil coming to life. And I know that might be a bit of a pipe dream, and that not everybody's going to have the opportunity to introduce livestock, or maybe not want to introduce livestock, but I want to give you some examples as we go through today how that might be possible in some situations. Now, I've been using the term green manures, but in the last few years there has been also the term cover crops used in the UK quite widely. And the cover crop term has come in as a result of greening measures within our agricultural system. And for me, though, green manures and cover crops are pretty much one and the same thing. in my mind, I don't tend to distinguish between them. These are just both crops that are going to deliver biomass to the soil. So if we can just carry on thinking like that, I'll use both terms probably as we go through. And when you come to think about what actually are the plant species that we can choose from, you can, to a degree, categorize them into the following categories. Now, I've started with the obvious ones, the nitrogen-fixing green manures, and this is what the Greeks would have thought about in the way that they use their beans as plants that left the soil in more fertile condition immediately after the beans were incorporated and grew their next crop. And for us, although we're not using beans in many cases because of the cost of seed, we are using quite a lot of different legumes, which of course the bean is a member of that family. And I want to give you just what I think are the main species that are used for green manures. Now, I've just started with crimson clover here as depicting an annual green manure. Lots of biomass, grows really quickly, fixes quite a bit of nitrogen, not a bad root structure, and is a good all-rounder. Beautiful flower, and a lot of people grow it just for that reason actually, but it's also quite helpful for pollinators. But if you look at the range that we have, these are the other plants. So in addition to the crimson clover, we also have Persian clover, we have vetch, and we have yellow trefoil. And these are short-term plants that make roots very quickly, that fix nitrogen very quickly, and they are one of the staples of short-term green manures. There's the biennial, which is sweet clover, and that's a plant that will overwinter and then grow the following year. It won't be killed by the winter, which many of the others will be. The Persian and the crimson in particular can be lost over the winter. Sweet clover will go through the winter in a dormant phase and then can come back the following spring and surprise you, particularly if you're an organic grower, because that rootstock is with a crown on it is more than capable of regrowing and coming up in your main crop the following year when you think you've incorporated it. But things like Persian clover, for example, are very useful if you're planting them perhaps in August or September. You can get a lot of biomass, and then the frost will wipe them out in, well, about now, when we get our first proper frosts in November. Vetches are a winter hardy annual. Again, great for fixing nitrogen when the weather's warm, but they will overwinter as in the green state. And so you can see that even within the category of annual nitrogen-fixing plants, there's quite a lot of differences between the plants, and that's where it comes down to local knowledge and local selection. And I'm not going to go through every single detail today because all of us will have different requirements, but there is local knowledge out there. I'll draw your attention to some source of information in a minute, but you will see, information. Finally, there are the longer-term nitrogen-fixing plants like red clover, sainfoin and lucerne, white clover, which have been true bastions of soil fertility building in the past, and in some situations where there are long-term opportunities to build fertility, then that is that they are very, very useful indeed. But they're not very quick to grow in the first instance, and that's where the annuals fit in. One thing I would like just to stress about nitrogen fixation is that it only happens, that's nitrogen fixation that is, between the warm months or during the warm months. So something like April to September in most districts is when you're going to get nitrogen fixed. Today there won't be any nitrogen being fixed. And it's something, when you think about it, it's really fundamentally important to what we're doing. So if you take opportunities in the middle of the summer to grow the annual legumes, you will get huge amounts of nitrogen fixed. But if your legume isn't being sown till perhaps late September, for example, it might grow green, but it's not going to fix very much nitrogen. And adding organic matter is really important, and I think the most important thing, but also building levels of nitrogen, as we know, is also pretty close behind it. So think very carefully about when these are going in as to whether they can fix nitrogen or not. And you might also think about, well, if they're not going to fix nitrogen, can we hold nitrogen? I'll come to that in a second. One question that's always asked in my experience is how much nitrogen do these legumes fix? Well, I'm afraid it is how long is a piece of string question. The answer is it varies enormously. All the scientific papers that you find on this subject vary. Of course, naturally it varies dependent on plant growth, temperature, moisture availability, bacteria in the soil, the species, the compatibility with the soil type. There's a huge variance, but the fact of the matter is they do fix nitrogen, and plants don't need huge amounts of nitrogen. They just need enough. And in my opinion, even at low levels of nitrogen, green manures can often provide much better crops than those that are receiving ammonium nitrate, for example, which is available in a very quick flush. These plants break down much more slowly, so it's much more efficiently used in the scheme of growing a crop. It's also possible to pick up nitrogen that's free floating in the soil by using short-term green manure crops. And this is a great example. This is a Westerwald ryegrass, which if you had it in the ground today and it was maybe 6 or 8 inches high from a sowing in August or September, you'd be picking up nearly all of the nitrogen that was available in the soil at that time. So it's a really useful species to sow either in a mix with a mix of summer legumes, or perhaps in a simple mixture for an overwinter nitrogen catching crop. It's quite commonly used. It's relatively cheap seed. There are others though. So here's your list of the other ones that people use. On the left-hand side, you can see cereal rye and Westerwald ryegrass, and they are the two overwinter nitrogen-catching plants that are commonly used. But again, if you were looking at longer-term grasses, then you wouldn't use those two short-term ones, or at least you would restrict the use of those in a seed mix, and you would increase the use of the perennial longer-term grasses if you had more than a season. And so it depends where we draw our line on short-term green manures, whether it's 3 months, 6 months, or 9 months. They're still, to me, all relatively short term green manures. And there's nothing stopping you combining those together. And if you look at the difference in root structures, in root depth, and in persistence, then you can combine. And going back to what Darwin said, every different plant will grow in different times in different places and have its day. I think it's really important that we don't just look at the highlight, the headline of one plant and just say, well, that's got to be that one, when actually, yes, it's good, but the gap, the weakness of that plant can be plugged with another one, and that's the way we should be thinking about using green manures.
Sorry, Ian, can I just quickly ask a question? If you know roughly how much nitrogen your legume has fixed, how do you know when it's been released?
That's a really good question, Kat. The nitrogen becomes available or is mineralized back into the soil as the plant decays. So there can be quite a long period, in fact, and it depends a little bit on what type of plant it is. If it's a very fleshy, high nitrogen plant rather than an older lignified carbon-rich plant, then naturally the younger plant breaks down more quickly and releases nitrogen quite quickly. And I'll just give you an example. If you take something like a common vetch, which is commonly used as a 6-month green manure and often incorporated in about April, the mineralization, according to work that was done at the Henry Doubleday Research Association and what is now Garden Organic, was showing, I think, the peak release was about 3 months after incorporation. Now, there will be differences between different types of incorporation. There will be differences on different soil types and different weather. So naturally, again, it's a little bit how long is a piece of string. But you need to think a little bit in advance. Where is your peak demand likely to be with your cash crop? And can we at least get some rhythm going between the incorporation of the green manure and the availability of N to that cash crop? I think it isn't a precise science, and it does vary, but the principle of it's important. It is not available day one. In fact, with many green manures, you actually lock up N when you incorporate them, not release it. So it depends on the state of the plant, but it will come available, and you need to think a little bit ahead in terms of incorporation. It's a good question. I'm sure there's a lot more detail there if we wanted to go into it, but I think maybe we're going to run out of time.
Yeah, you're probably right. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, and then finally, we've had nitrogen fixing plants and we've had nitrogen lifting plants, and this sort of final category doesn't fit into either of those particularly well. So I've just put them under the heading of structure and biology, because for me these are plants that can be grown with the nitrogen fixers and the nitrogen lifters as part of a mix, but have special properties. So in the case of buckwheat, for example, it's a very fast-growing plant. It's actually been killed now this time of year by the frost, but there is this association that it has with making phosphate available. Now, in some systems, phosphates will be short, and buckwheat is known to, through its roots exudates, to make phosphate available to the next crop. So as part of a mix, it's really useful. It's also great bird seed, by the way, and I haven't put a bird on this slide, but these plants have other benefits. It's also one that we've been growing with longer term green manures, and we've been using it as a nurse crop. It grows ever so quickly. It's not the best smotherer of weeds in the world because it has a fairly open canopy, but the benefit of that is that we've grown it as a very quick growing nurse crop, which has protected and created a canopy over our longer term cover green crop, and that's left that in a beautiful condition just now, and it's been quite literally desiccated in the field, and you see all these stalks, and but underneath it is this lovely, well-protected, longer-term, slower growing cover crop. So we've got the best of both worlds. The radish is interesting. You can see what's going to happen when that's destroyed. You get this lovely channel through the soil, which is great for water infiltration, root penetration, and so on. It's yet another type of plant root which is doing something different to the rest of them. The Phacelia is often used, particularly in polytunnels, very quick to grow, great root structure to start off with, good for beneficial insects and pollinators. So again, you can see quite different plants, quite different root structures, but the one I really like, but it has to be in the ground for a good year, is the chicory. Chicory is one of those plants that has just got this ability to punch through soil, to leave channels in soil, and when you dig soil pits, and I'll show you one in a minute, you can just see where its roots go. It's just such a good deep rooting plant. Some plants are deep rooting if they've got the right soil conditions, but this one will go through stone. It is amazing. And here is a sort of depicting an example of a mix of species, and you can begin to see the biodiversity in that mix. So above and below ground, and you only got to dig up and you see these mixes compared to the monoculture option, which and you begin to realize that there's a whole life there, and we don't get this in our main cash cropping situation. We haven't got that opportunity to increase the soil life, and for me the green manure is such a great way of doing that. So you can really improve the soil quite dramatically. It's also a very marketable thing. I think this. I think that UK agriculture, or should I say individual family farms, probably a better description, but could be marketing this as really beneficial to the wider environment in terms of soil infiltration, pollinator habitats, wild bird seed, soil quality, water quality. It's all there in these green crops, and it just really needs somebody to have some joined-up thinking at a policy level, I believe, to make this happen on a much bigger scale. We do need to do this because the soils are in desperate need of improvement. Just finally, to summarise that section, this is a bar chart showing the species that we've talked about so far, and this is looking purely at biomass yield. Remember, biomass yield is the thing that adds the total volume of above ground organic matter. I haven't got root yield figures, it varies enormously, but they're very similar, and they sort of correlate quite nicely with the above ground yield. But just look at the differences, and it'd be really easy, wouldn't it, to say, well, we'll take Westerwald ryegrass. That's the one that's giving us the highest yield. But again, if we take our average figure, we see that the average is what you'd expect, an average. But it's when you add them, when you look at the actual biomass yield, that you get this over yielding effect. And there is that, the Westerwald does stick out a little bit there, but in this particular work. But you can see that you really don't lose very much by adding these other species in, but you gain so much in terms of nitrogen fixation, pollinator delivery, and so on. So for me, it's a win-win. Kat, I think there was a question that we were going to ask at this point about how people are using their green manures. Do you have it there on the poll?
I do, yeah. So to see which type of green manure to use, it should come on your screen now. Yeah, it's a close run race.
Okay.
No, it looks like the majority of people are using overwinter green manures,
yep.
Followed by summer, with a few using the ones from more than 1 year. Maybe give people a few more seconds to vote. It looks like most people voted, but not quite everyone.
Okay, that's great. If you just add anything in, Kat, please, when it comes in, just add. But I'll start with the short-term green manure, which is this picture that I'm stood in here back in the summer. And this is, I think, a really important slide, because you can see, if you judge the crops in the background, you can see it's a dry soil, you can see it's a summer's day, but look at the volume of growth. That's in, I think that was taken in August, and this was at the end of about an 8-week growth period. And if you look carefully, you can see there are mustard seed pods ripening at the top of the crop. But what's really, really important here is that once that mustard had gone, is that the flowers, the pink flowers, are all the different clovers. So you've got Persian clover, crimson clover, and my goodness, I can only tell you from my experience here that we thought that was good, but then it carried on growing, and the mustard was then dwarfed by the clover. And it was really interesting because we hadn't quite realized the difference that the different species would have, but it's the Darwin theory yet again, and we see this time and time and time again. You need to allow these things to grow at their full potential, and believe you me, they really do grow if you get the right combination of species on the right soil type. We had quite a good growing year on this particular soil. It was stony brash soil, very dry soil, but it was a tremendous crop, and I haven't got data on it, I'm afraid to give you, but it was the experience of seeing that changeover from the mustard, which was the quick front runner, that was ready 2 to 3 weeks earlier than the other clovers that grew up after it. It was a really interesting experience. So there's one option, and that's clearly what some people are doing, and the other option is the. It's third, is it? Okay. And the other option is this one, which is the overwinter option, which of course a lot of people, from what you've just said, are using. And this is a picture in the I think it was taken in June, and this is a mixture of rye and vetch, and this was sown in September. And then overwintered, and you can see it was a huge crop, as you'd expect with rye and vetch, and they just keep growing, and so you've got this lovely nitrogen fixation going on in the spring with the vetches. You've got winter cover, soil, covered, when it would at this time of year would rain and would lose the nitrogen. The rye picks all that up, so this is cereal rye, a big tall plant, a very carbon-rich plant with a very high protein or a very high nitrogen plant with the vetches. It's a great combination, really simple combination. There was virtually no weeds in that crop, and I'll tell you how we destroyed it in a minute. And then finally, there is this, of these 3 types, there's this longer term thing, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But I do genuinely think that this is, these are grass-based lays, which were traditionally used, of course, in the UK for, the mixed farming system. But this is where the real, long-term fertility building comes from, whether you be on light or heavy soils, and because it just brings the structure, it adds so much organic matter and structure to the soil, and the soil biology increases dramatically. Of course, there are issues around, having livestock or not, but I'll come to that in a second. And the final method is intercropping or companion cropping, and there's been some interesting pieces of work on this. There's been a Nuffield scholarship recently on this with Andy Howard in Kent, looking at whether you can grow a green manure effectively or a cover crop with a main crop. And I think the answer is yes, you can. It's often been done, and we've seen many different types of intercropping, companion cropping used. This photograph just depicts a very simple brassica main crop with clover and yellow truffle sown between it. And I believe in this particular situation, the clover and truffle was drilled in first, and then the brassica main crop was transplanted into that. Now, I'm not sure on the exact machinery, so forgive me, but this was over at Peterborough a few years ago, and you can see how it works. The clovers and the truffles are not at all, they're not interfering with that main crop at all, and yet they will cover a lot of the ground. If they're, in fact, looking at clover and yellow truffle today from sowings earlier in the year, it's 100% ground cover, and there's the odd weed, not very many, but there's a huge amount of nitrogen been built up, and most importantly, the weeds have been suppressed, so it keeps the moisture in and so on. So I think there's a lot of potential in that, and everybody's going to have a different take on this depending on what their rotation is and where these can fit. But you can fit legumes, particularly, in with most main crops if you experiment. So,
Ian, do you know of any successful techniques or examples of planting the crop into the existing stand of green manures?
Okay, so you could, for example, so in this case, a drill was used, and you can see the row width on the drill is, and I'm guessing, about 7 or 8 inches width. So the drill has been used and it's planted between what will then be filled in with the main crop. So this was sown before the main crop. The alternative is the main crop is established first, and then seed could be drilled or broadcast into the standing crop. And that can work equally as well. Sometimes it's very nice to have a green crop that can remain in place for more than one cash crop. So in this case with white clover and yellow truffle, that could stay down for a period of time and you could drill into it or plant into it with your main crop. Alternatively, the main crop could be sown with, once the main crop is establishing, could be sown with an understory green manure. So that would be effectively broadcast, or possibly drilled, but very often just broadcast into the standing crop. So if you thought, for example, of sweet corn as an example, big tall crop, which you then in May, June time would broadcast, subject to moisture, but broadcast some low-growing legume into the bottom of that, that would work quite well as an example. So yeah, there are different techniques, and I think you have to think very much about your own situation here, because it's not, do you have a drill, do you have something that could spin seed, and what's, likely rainfall, how quickly does your soil dry out, could it be established the autumn before you need it, for example? Is there a gap there in the rotation? So I think you just have to think, when can I get this going? And when do I need it for? Can it be grazed? Is it going to be mown? There's lots of factors that come into your decision making, but the answer is most people improvise pretty well in my experience, and there's some really good examples. Ian Tolhurst, for example, just off the top of my head, but I mean he's sort of used a lot of techniques to have cover crops with his main crops as an example. There's lots of arable examples as well, and we've all often sown longer term fertility building lays, which on mixed farms where they're undersown to spring cereals. So yeah, I think the answer is that there's all sorts of possibilities, but there isn't a black and white. There are no two or three just examples. There's lots of examples you could create.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks, Ian.
Okay. So I guess that sort of leads on to termination of these green crops. It's one of those subjects that is really difficult to grasp, because you have to work with the kit you have. You have to think ahead. You don't want allelopathic effects, which is where the green crop might interfere with your next crop negatively. What machinery do you have? What's the time of year? There's so many options. So I'm going to run through what I think are the most important ones and see how you feel about all this. One of the things to start off with is this situation that we find ourselves in with glyphosate. And a lot of green manures in conventional systems have been terminated with glyphosate. But for reasons that I'm not going to go into, we are now facing quite a big potential problem with that system. So there needs to be alternatives, and that's what I'm going to look at now. The rye vetch crop that I showed you, which was the overwinter crop, is a big tall crop, and you have to say, well, that's great from a biomass point of view, but actually what am I going to do with it in terms of incorporating it? So in this case, what we did, and there are lots of ways of doing this, I guess, but we decided that we would, in this particular part of the field, we would mow it. So we used a flail mower, which we put on the front of the tractor. Otherwise you tend to not get half the stuff that you run over with a tractor. We're lucky that we've got a front mounted flail mower, and we cut and into small pieces, and then we ploughed it. So we felt that in this particular situation we didn't have any option with this technique. So mowing and then drilling into it, I guess, is a possibility if you have the right drill, but we decided that we would plough it, and so that's what we did. So mowing and ploughing. There is also a possibility of using new techniques. This is the same crop. This is a crimper roller, which is based on the idea of a heavy roller with blades on it, and the roller is pushed along again in the front. In this case, in the front, you could mount it on the back of the tractor, and you crush the crop. And the timing of this technique is really important. This is the first year we've used it. We took the plans for this machine from the Acres website in America. They've developed their own crimper rollers over there, and they're very kindly released the plans to make one. So we had one made here in the UK at a cost, but it was about £1,500 for a 2.1 metre width roller, which we thought was acceptable for the work we're doing. And this is heavy. We filled it with water, and we tried it at various stages throughout the year, and we found at some points it didn't work, and some points it did. And our experience was that when the crop was young, we rolled it, it bounced back up again, went back a week or 2 weeks later, and the same crop that we'd rolled flat had miraculously come back up, even with all the weight in the roller. And I certainly wouldn't want to get my hand stuck under it or my toe stuck under it. I can tell you, it's pretty heavy. But it didn't kill it. So I think there's a point about, actually, will it work? And I think the answer is yes, providing the crop is mature. So that's one thing. The second thing was we went through various weeks of experiments, and we found that the vetches were beginning to set seed by the time that we were getting a good kill, which meant that we've got a lot of vetch seed in our rotation on this particular area, which actually has recovered now and is grown from the seed. We've got a lovely green manure for nothing. But the thing is, it would have been a problem had we put a cash crop in immediately after this. So I think the technique of using this might come back slightly against what I believe, but might come back to using monocultures where you can control the exact point at which you terminate the crop with one single species. So rye, for example, would be a good example where you would terminate that crop just as the grains are beginning to sort of firm up, so sort of past the milky doughy stage, just about there, then you'll kill the crop. That was our experience this year. But we went a step further than this. We decided that what we would do is put the drill on the back of the tractor and see whether we couldn't drill straight into the rolled crop. And we'd seen this done on YouTube in America. People seemed to be quite confident it was working with the right setup. Our drill is a coulter drill, but it has discs mounted just in front of the coulters. And this is what happened to us. You can see quite clearly the coulters at the front by the tractor, and then the discs at the front by the tractor and the coulters that run behind them. But this is, we hadn't got more than a couple of meters into the field, and we've just picked this drill up because it just blocked up straight away. So unfortunately for us, unless we want to change our drill, which we don't, that combination didn't work. So I suspect that with the crimper roller, the answer lies in thinking very clearly about your plans for sowing your next crop and whether you can crimp roll, and it's such a great low-cost way of doing it. I mean, you've got to get a crimper roller, but or you might even use your own flat roller. Actually, it might work just as well in some situations. But it's that combination. Will the drill run through it behind it? And if it did, then you could have this sort of cover, this armor on the surface of the soil that the Americans refer to, and you would drill your crop straight into it, and that could be brilliant. But in our case, it didn't work. We'll carry on experimenting with this, and there might well be some ways of improving what we did in terms of growth stage, or maybe monoculture. We'll see.
Sorry, just before we move on, I just wanted, because we've just got about 10 minutes left of the official time, I just wanted to let everyone know that it will all be available afterwards, so we'll send it around as a recording, just in case anybody has to rush off, and just to encourage you, maybe if you do need to leave at past, just maybe to give us your questions now. And there was, sorry to jump around, there was actually one from earlier on, from Stephen Cartwright. If it's okay to ask that now, Ian. He says
yes.
He's repairing to compacted clay ground to plant a traditional orchard. It's just about to lime the field for increasing the pH. When can he plant the chicory, red clover, etc.? What is the best way to prepare and broadcast plants? And
okay,
how long
great, yeah, well done on the traditional orchard. I think that's a great idea, first of all. And the answer is that the next opportunity for a chicory clover lay like that would be, in most districts, unless you're an extreme district, but in most districts would be middle to late April. I wouldn't rush that in. I'd certainly get the lime onto the soil in good time. The lime needs to, as you know, needs to be worked into the soil, and there will be a little bit of time between the lime going on and the effect that it has. But in principle, late April would be the right time. And if you're in a reasonable rainfall district, there's no reason why you couldn't sow that even later. Very often those layers are sown May, June, and then in the summer. Not in the autumn, though. I think they're not so good in September. They're much better. They need to go in, get established to get the roots going before the winter comes.
Great,
I hope that
thank you.
answers the question. If you wanted to follow up on that, more than happy to give some advice specifically on that. At some point in the future, if you want to ring in or whatever, please feel free, Stefan. But good luck with it. Great orchard. Just to say that the detail that we can't do today because we haven't got time is in the Sort Out Your Soil. We're just republishing it actually this year, second edition, which the first edition was 5 or 6 years ago, which gives information on sowing rates, timings, incorporation, and all the rest of it. So everything we haven't said today is in there somewhere, and that will be available in the new year. And I did say, and I will move on because I'm conscious of time, I did say I wanted to talk about livestock. And I know that this illustration is a lot of fun, but it does depict the manurial effect of having livestock on the farm. And if we're growing these deep rooting plants, one way of utilizing the biomass in a much enhanced way is to put it through a ruminant animal. These animals, sheep and cattle, of course, are designed to eat green plants. We can't, they can. And what they do is through this recycling system, not only are they a crop in their own right, but the manure and the urine that they leave behind are wonderful sources for the soil's life. And the protozoa, the earthworms, the flies, some we like, some we don't, but they're all part of the soil. And I think that for me, this is a really important opportunity that we have now with so much change going on in the world to think about reintroducing livestock into arable systems.
Would you like to ask people quickly whether they're already doing that, Ian?
Yes, I would like to know because it might be that everybody's already done it, which would be my work is done.
Okay, there's a poll on everyone's screen now, so just the numbers are coming in at the moment. Looking like the majority of people haven't introduced livestock, 70% to 20%, with one or two considering it.
Okay, that's really helpful. And I have to say, I've been, for most of my career, I've been the person that doesn't want to look after livestock, although we've had livestock at home. I still have resisted the urge to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and milk cows since I left agricultural college. But there are lots of people out there who disagree with me really strongly. And here's the case. These are some of my farming neighbours, and Nigel and Ed, his son, and this is just an example that I've seen quite a lot in the last few years. Ed wants to expand his sheep flock. Nigel's farm is only so big, and Ed has gone, of course, to local farmers, including ourselves, and said, well, we've got sheep, you've got land, is there a partnership here that we could arrange? And the answer is yes. As far as I'm concerned, particularly with our case study, which I'll tell you in a second briefly, was really, really important. So we have benefited from having this partnership with other people. You don't necessarily have to have your own livestock to have them on the farm. This is what we've been doing on our farm. This is mob grazing. This is electric fencing and water supply. This is all we needed to graze our green manure crops. These are long-term green manures, which we incorporated. This is me wondering how this water trough works for the sheep behind me. But I can tell you I did this every day for 5 months this summer. I really enjoyed being with the livestock and the animals, and it was a great positive experience. A little bit of learning in the first place and about £1,500 on equipment. But we're still using that now. In fact, the sheep have just been moved today. So, to me, it works. There is a guide just on this subject of mob grazing, which was produced this year, which we produced, and again, it covers the basics. Should anybody wish it, please request a copy. And I just want to talk briefly about root depth before going on to some case studies. And just to highlight this root depth issue, it's a big issue for UK farming. We've had dry times, we've had wet times. We always have issues with surface runoff, with flood management issues, water quality issues, soil organic matter. Root depth is really important. When you compare the plants we've been talking about, some have much deeper roots than others. And I think it's really important that we begin to look at these roots as a very distinguishing factor when it comes to plant selection. We haven't really looked because it's difficult to see them. This is on our farm. This is a root depth of a 1-year-old ryegrass lay. We haven't got a lot of soil on this farm, on this particular area of it. We only have about 6 inches of topsoil at the most, and then it's stony brash, you can see, and you have to trust me, but my hand is where the roots stop after 1 year's growth. This, on the other hand, is a deep rooting alternative with chicory. And again, you're going to have to trust me here, but there are roots which, bear in mind, it's only 1 year old, which are going down about a metre. We only dug to just over a metre deep with the digger to get down through that stone, and it's stoned the rest of the way down as far as we can see to the centre of the earth. But it's just, like I say, the plants get through this. It's an amazing thing to see, and I'm proposing to take these photographs over the next 4 years to see how deep we can get them. And so when the moisture stops, or when the rain stops, it's difficult to imagine that over the last couple of days, but it does, as you know, in the summer. This is what happens. The plants run out of water. And the other thing that's really important is to say that the plants can draw minerals, the deeper rooting ones that the grasses and the clovers don't. And these are the important minerals. You look for the science on this, it's really difficult to find. But I did find something which I'll share with you now, which is really interesting. McCants and Widowson were the authors of this report, and they started their work back in the 1940s, and it carried on until the early 1990s. They looked at mineral content decline in food. If you haven't seen this, Google it. It's really interesting information. This is the summary of their work on the main elements, with main minerals in food, which they knew about at the time. There are some that they didn't know, which we now look at, but this is really interesting data. So over a 50-year period, the mineral content of food declined. So this is food that you and I are eating, as well as our soil animals and our farm animals and so on. So big declines in vegetables. This is just an average. The details are there in their report if you care to look. This is fruit. Fruit is the same pattern, very big declines in mineral content over a 50-year period. And finally, in meat, again, the same decline. And we could analyse the details, but I think it's suffice to say that we have lost mineral content in our soil as a result largely of monoculture, shallow-rooted farming. If we had more time, we could cover it. Very quickly, just to finish with then, a couple of case studies. This is our farm, Honeydale Farm, which we were fortunate enough to take on 3 years ago. And this is a typical sort of Cotswold farm. It's 107 acres. We're ever so pleased to be farming this now. And for the first year, we carried on farming it in exactly the same way that the previous owners had done, with big equipment from the local estate and contract farmed, and we grew a fine crop of barley. This is my wife looking over the barley. She was ever so impressed with this. This was 60 acres of barley, and she thought it was marvellous, and that feeling was unfortunately jettisoned when we looked at the financial return, because we actually lost £64 during the course of growing the crop. It was a fine crop. It was a high-yielding crop for the soil. It had a malting barley premium, but it typifies for me what's wrong with monoculture and the system that we currently farm. You know, it's not diverse enough, and it is not profitable enough. And without profit there, we know a lot of farmers are not going to go on with this system. This is why I could have picked any of these costs. I'm just looking here at nitrogen fertilizer prices. They've crept up over the last decade or two. We all know this, but it is interesting when you look at them, and the price of the grain hasn't, and the price of our output, whatever crop we care to look at, has hardly gone up at all. So we've changed the farm quite considerably since we took it on, and we're now growing deep-rooting legumes, self-sufficient plants which build soil fertility, and we're building our farming strategy completely around those. And we now have a very diverse farm. We believe, as Cato did over 2,000 years ago, that farmers should have a low cost of production. I don't want to see lorries coming down our drive which are and followed by a very last check for fertilizer or for agrochemicals. It's not that I'm against those per se, it's just that I feel that it's just not viable. And so I want to be a seller of materials, not a buyer.
Ian, can I ask, when people are making the decision about investing in seeds and weighing it up against the benefits, it's sometimes that can also be sometimes a tricky decision to make. Have you got any advice on how to make that decision?
Yeah, it's a good question, Kat. And the fact of the matter is, for 30 years, in my experience at any rate, people have always had a resistance to two things. One is the cost of the input, so the cost, in this case, the cost of seed for green manures, and the second thing is the lack of production while they're there. I hope I've shown some evidence to show that what happens if you don't put stuff back into the soil, because if you keep depleting it, we will see food content slide. We'll see the cost of production going up because we're having to put more and more on to produce the same. We all know that. So I don't think it's a question so much of, as pure economics. It's a question of, the land we have available now has to continue to provide. And the only way I can see of doing that is to add organic matter back in through the various sources, through livestock production perhaps, through green manures perhaps, and also through compost. There is no other way. And the more we try and put it, cost it, I'm afraid the more we come up with resistance. And so I say not so much can we afford to do this and is it viable, I'd say can we afford not to do this. So I feel, as you might sense, quite strongly about this whole subject, and I make no apologies for that, because I think it is our responsibility to get, to look after this precious resource of soil. I was in London last night with a huge population, right in the middle of London, and I came out back to the Cotswolds on the last train, and it really struck me how dependent a huge amount of people are on a handful of agriculturalists out there. And, it is really striking when you sit back and look at the global picture. Our population in my lifetime, in fact, since I started doing what I do, has doubled, as we all know, but the land area that we now farm worldwide has only gone up by 11%. The graph looks really, really quite horrible. And I feel it is our responsibility right now to take control of what we're doing with the soil, and not to just say, well, it's not viable, we won't do it. I know some people will disagree with me on that. I'm quite prepared to have that debate, but I really think it is time we took responsibility for it.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, thank you, Ian. That's really helpful.
Okay. And I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move on very quickly with a few photos. This is Ed's sheep, my friends, my neighbours' sheep, grazing. So this is recycling our organic matter free of charge, adding value to the organic matter, and this area now has just grown a crop of turnips and is next going to grow a crop of spring wheat. And none of these ideas are new, of course. This is an old problem. This slide depicts finally the Robert Elliott's Clifton Park farming system, which I always think of at these times, because he had a problem with low commodity prices, so his produce was not really attracting very much money. He was spending a lot on inputs, and he found that the best way he could farm over a lifetime was to build fertility in the soil through his cropping and harvest that through and sell his, he's self-sufficient, really. And it's a great book. Clifton Park Farming System is such a great book to read. But no matter where you are in the country, he was in the Scottish borders, but it's the principle of what he said is really quite interesting. Here's a modern day version, Jonathan Boas, who is in Worcestershire. He's a crop farmer. He has no livestock, but has introduced green manures onto his farm in quite a big way. And he was having problems with his clay soil. He couldn't get seedbeds easily. It was costing a lot of money. He had problems with blackgrass control, and introduced break crops. He ended up selling and has ended up selling some of these crops as hay off the farm to livestock, but he doesn't actually have, at least I don't think he currently has livestock on the farm. So a modern day example. And here's another example of farm at Peterborough, reasonably large scale organic production, but heavily dependent on fertility building lays as part of the rotation to, it's organic to drive, this is Riverford of course, to drive fertility up. And because of the way in which the farmers work, they've had, certainly for some time, flying flocks of sheep coming in for a limited period to graze these lays, and that's enhancing the soil biology. Really nice simple example of how you could see it working on a bigger scale. And then just to sum up finally, and I'll finish, here we are on a lot of farms, monoculture. I understand why we're here, I understand how it's got there, but it's not working terribly well. I think crop diversity is part of our future. I think that would work much better. But crop diversity with green manures in them is even better. And it won't surprise you that I then go on to say that with green manures that are mixed species rather than single species will enhance the biology more. And finally, the icing on the cake for me would be the livestock integration. And that's where I think some farms will have to go in order to increase soil fertility in the future. There will be people right in the middle of this somewhere as well, and there'll be some people that won't want to change. I really worry about the state of soil when they don't change in the future. So on that note, thank you very much, everyone. I hope you're still there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ian. That was fantastic. I hope everyone enjoyed it. While we're still here, does anyone have any questions? Just feel free to type them in the questions box down the bottom if you're the panel on the right. Maybe while we're waiting for some of those to come in, Ian, I had one more question. The title of this talk was strategies for short-term strategies for intensive growers. Do you feel that the short-term strategy is the right strategy for growing?
I think farming is, for me, farming is a lifetime business, and I know that we're in a commercial economic world, and we're continually reminded of that fact. I still feel, and maybe it's the older I get, I'm only 53, but I still feel that that's not farming. It's pure economics, and we're being driven by market forces in a job of agriculture, producing food, that actually is more than market forces. We all consume the food, and we all drink the water that runs into these farms or off these farms, and we do it 3 times a day, and yet we only think of it economically, or at least the masses only think of it economically. And I think that's a mistake. And I do think that we should be thinking of farming generationally. I think we should be cropping on the long-term rotations, not short. And I understand, of course, that there are tenancy arrangements and there's farm business arrangements that are short-term, and naturally they have to be viable, otherwise people won't participate in them. But as a general principle, I think we are eluding ourselves to think that farming is only about short-term growing. It's not.
Thank you ever so much for today and for sharing your story and the other case studies. And thanks everybody who's been listening.